Thank you for everybody join the privacy talk. I'm so honored to invite Thiago from Brazil. He's doing exclusive research. Today we're gonna discuss about his practice and missions. So that was so exciting. So Thiago, thank you for joining today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, Carson.
Thank you. First of all, I introduce his profile. Thiago Moraes is a PhD candidate in a joint degree program between the University de Brasilia and Vrije University in Brussels. He holds an LLM in Law and Technology and MS in Information Science and two BScs in Law and Network Engineering. Furthermore, he is the coordinator of innovation and research at the Brazilian Data Protection Authority, ANPAT, and was also its first data protection officer. He's a co-founder of Laboratory of Public Policy and Internet, PIN, and is also the member of IAPP with CIPPE, CIPM, CIPD, and CDPO. So that's gonna be the very good conversation, Diego. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. And first of all, let's go to the today's agenda. I'd like to ask about your activity because you are keen to work on the data protection space right now. So could you tell us why did you start to work in the data protection sector?
Yeah, okay. Great. That's a great question. It's interesting because it has to do with my personal academic trajectory. As you just mentioned, I first have done a bachelor's in network engineering, and by that time I started doing a master in information science because I have been a lot of interest in how technology connects with people, like maybe people connect with each other and how it impacts society. And maybe because of that, that was a natural path for me to start going to humanities course. So I started to do law, a bachelor's in law. And from there, I kept like researching more and more of the connection between law and technology, which the master that I did after Tilburg. So in principle, I was looking a lot of like intellectual property when I was in my bachelor's in law, because it's also a topic that has a lot of technology and law related. But the thing for me is that IP didn't sound to me so appealing as a right like we have in data protection, which is a fundamental right which directly relates with people, not only with assets of a company. So that's why when I moved to Netherlands to do my master, my second master, I decided that I would focus on data protection. And I think it was a very good decision because at the same time in Brazil, the data protection environment was developing. We were advancing data protection legislation. It was still not approved. It was actually approved while I was abroad, but that was a perfect timing because by the time I finished my master, the we were already like waiting to the data protection authorities to be created. So everything was connecting in the end.
Yeah, that sounds interesting history. So as for now, you like doing many of the research at this moment. Could you briefly explain what you have been researching in your PhD?
Yeah, great. Yeah, so my PhD, which I just started like last year, uh, it was the result of my last activities within the Data Protection Authority. Since I started working there, I've been getting closer and closer to a specific technology, which is artificial intelligence, since there's a lot of connection between artificial intelligence and some concepts of data protection legislation because, of course, it's not all the case, but many cases, AI systems process personal data, and usually the high risk cases are related with personal data processing. Like, what I mean is that usually when we see in legislation such as the AI Act, that sensitive data, sensitive personal data is being processed. Usually, this is the context where we are worried as a high risk AI system. So, because of that, and at the same time, I understand that we need to have a good regulation protecting our rights of citizens on AI. I also think it's very important that we guarantee that the productive sector continues to be innovative, right? We don't want to hinder innovation. And that's when I decided that I would like to find this balancing ground. And one specific regulatory tool that exists nowadays that have been talked more and more, it started in the financial sector, but nowadays every sector have initiatives related with that, are the regulatory sandboxes. So basically, if I could say in a single sentence, what I'm going to research in my PhD is how we can use regulatory sandboxes to foster responsible AI innovation.
Yeah, that sounds very awesome. And about the regulatory sandbox, we want to touch after the topics that are being very important as well. So you involved as the part of the ANPAD is the Data Protection Authority in Brazil. So how your research has been connected to your work at the Data Protection Authority?
Okay, that's a great question as well, because it's very challenging to do a PhD and not being like exclusively focused on your PhD. And in my case, I am working at the NPD at the same time and doing the PhD, so which can be very challenging. So a way of like trying to guarantee my focus on both activities is to merge what I'm doing in one place with the other, and that's what I've been doing for now. And so at the Brazilian Data Protection Authority, ANPD, we have been designing a regulatory sandbox pilot on AI and data protection. So as you see, if things go well and this project comes out of the paper, because we're still in the designing phase, we're still looking for the right resources and the right legal rules for allowing it to be implemented. But if things go well, I'll have a very interesting use case for my own research. And of course, this means that a lot of these uh, goals that I have in my PhD of trying to see, for example, if we can promote algorithmic transparency within a sandbox or something like that, I also bring into the work that I'm doing there. It's not, of course, it's not the only project that I had to coordinate at the Brazilian Data Protection Authority, but since it's the one that's closer related with my PhD, is the one that I have been trying to give more attention of.
Yeah, thank you for your explanations. So that's been a very interesting history, why you were involved in this work at this moment. So from these terms, I'm gonna ask for the more deeper research of your some of the papers, your work. So, in terms of the data protection cultures in Latin America, it's evolving related to some of the influenced, such as the from Europe and Brussels especially. So, one of your paper, it's a very interesting to take an overview of these new movements. So how does the personal data protection culture in Latin America countries influenced by Brussels effect. So could you tell us about your overview?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks for making this question because this is related with research that I have participated together with other colleagues from the University of Brasilia from 2020 until 2023. So it was a 3, 4 years research. It took a little bit longer because of the pandemics, right? But this was a very interesting research, which was coordinated by Professor Alexandre Veronesi from UNB. I can introduce you to him in another time if you want, because he has been one of the leading researchers on data protection at the University of Brasilia. So he coordinated with a team of researchers, some PhD scholars. At that time, I was still not a PhD student, but I already was interested on starting my PhD path. So I joined this research group, and it was a very throughput research because we looked to all the countries in Latin America that had a data protection authority or data protection legislation by the time we started, because it's important to say that because since we have started the research, other countries have approved their own data protection legislation. So of course we couldn't like keep adding more because we need planning, etc. So at that time when we started the research, there were 8 countries that we have studied. So, uh, sorry if I don't recall of them, but it's Colombia, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Mexico, uh, Costa Rica, and Peru. Yeah, these were the countries. So what we've done was to research both literature, academic literature about these countries. This was very important because we didn't want to have a research just based on the perspective of the global north. We wanted to know how Latin American researchers, academics, were uh, understanding the data protection ecosystem in these countries. So it was very nice because we looked to literature of like Dr. Pablo Palazzi from Argentina, Nelson Remolina from Colombia. We've done like research with many scholars, so from these countries, and we also conducted interviews, both of these scholars and with other representatives from government, civil society, private sector. So it was very multi-stakeholder interview. It included some field visits to these countries. We visit all these countries. We share like the team split up, and we visit the data protection authorities in each one of these countries, which was also very nice. And from this very throughput research, we have published some papers. So this one that you mentioned is a specific one from one of the insights that we got, because of course, when we conducted this research, we wanted to understand more how different data protection cultures influence one another. So it was inevitable to look at to the Brussels effect, right? Because we know that the European continent has a long history of data protection. It had a directive before, and then the GDPR. So of course we wanted to see this influence, and it was very curious, very interesting to see because contrary to what some people might think, it's not exactly about a Brussels effect because the scenario is way more complex than just that. I'm not saying that Brussels effect doesn't happen, but it's not the only factor. So you understand my point. In Latin America, many countries had the red data protection legislation way before GDPR. And even the Directive 19.5, it was it didn't have the impact as, for example, the Spanish data protection law, which was the one that influenced several of the Spanish-speaking countries in Latin America. At the same time, other countries' data protection culture, privacy culture, were also influencing. So, for example, it was very interesting to find out that the landscape in US and also in the Asia Pacific region influenced a lot some countries from Latin America, like Mexico, because Mexico has a lot of connection with US, with Asian countries, also Chile, Colombia. So these countries all had some influence from, like, for example, the APEC CBPR or the US approach. So what I mean by that is that the scenario and the puzzle is way more complex than just associating to a specific region. And just to conclude this reflection, what was also interesting to realize is that these own countries, these Latin American countries, were impacting and influencing one another. For example, the region in the Caribbean that has been starting developing, so we looked at Costa Rica, but there was also like Honduras, Guatemala, all of these countries now are developing. So this region is developed, and they are looking a lot to the Mexican experience because Mexico is just right there, right? It's way closer in economic relationship, geographic proximity. At the same time, we see that Brazil, for example, is having some influence in some countries to update the legislation, like what we see in Argentina. So what is interesting is that there is a lot of exchanges, and especially nowadays that the Latin American countries, they have been enforcing this group called well, in English, it will be the Data Protection Ibero-American Network. So Rede Ibero-Americana de Protección de Datos. So this group meets several times per year to guarantee collaboration and in enforcement, in exchanging experience and knowledge. So I'm seeing that, of course, Brussels effect has some influence, but it's not the only one, you know?
Yeah, it's a very interesting history that the Latin America's countries has been passed in the in several years ago. Due to this, some of my Spanish or Italian friend is said it's Brazil is pretty advanced to take a step of ahead of the fundamental rights for all the citizens and just to coordinate it with the networks in Latin America. So your research and your leadership is very interesting for us in Asia as well. So as a next topic is about the AI specific because the AI is everywhere, but the coming the the balances of the using the AI, respecting the privacy or other fundamental rights. So maybe just started a more practical discussion in Europe, and Brazil is also the one of the countries where try to start the regulatory topics. So how does Brazil work for responsible AI at this moment from your publishment? So could you share about the idea?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. First of all, this goal of achieving responsible AI, it's very relevant and at the same time very challenging. And we can see that governments from all over the world is doing a lot of effort of doing that. Uh, we can say for sure that Japan, for example, is leading a lot of initiatives. So as we've seen when they promoted the G7, the data free flow with trust, and now more recently with the Hiroshima treaty regarding the generative AI. So what we see is that this discussion has not started today. It has been happening for a while, and thankfully Brazil is also very concerned on this context on this issue. But of course, there are several interests that come into force, and we have to be very careful when assessing what are the legitimacy of these interests and how they could how can we reach some kind of consensus. And this always takes a while. And why I'm saying that? Because we have different initiatives in Brazil. I briefly mentioned the ones that I consider more relevant, and maybe you understand my point. I believe the first leading initiative from Brazil regarding this topic was its Brazilian national strategy, the AI strategy. So the Brazilian national AI strategy, which we call EBIA, it was it it was launched in 2020. So actually, by that time, I was already like back in Brazil, and I worked in the drafting of this strategy. Unfortunately, for several political reasons, it couldn't develop, it couldn't mature as we wanted it to. It had, for political reasons, it had to be published as it was. So I am afraid it was published a bit incomplete in the sense that there were still some goals, some milestones that needed to be better estimated. But in any sense, it was important so we could position ourselves, right? And why I mentioned this strategy, because this strategy, of course, it was looking for economic productivity. So it had several axes looking for the educational sector, the productive sector, and work related, and at the same time, there was some transversal axes that were looking for ethics, governance, regulation. So this was important because it was a document that was trying to find this balance already. And I think this document has influenced the discussion that then we followed up in the legislative, because in the Brazilian Congress, the first legislation that called more attention on AI regulation, it was very principiological in the sense that they were going to have some principles, and then we would leave for self-regulation. We'll leave for companies do as they seem fit. They should look for these principles and just go. And this actually connects with many initiatives that we're seeing in other places at the time, like in the EU, which were like ethical guidelines and stuff like that, which of course is a very important first step. But we know that in the end, it's very it's a very weak way of like guaranteeing that things are going to happen, because you just have to like live to trust that people will follow these ethical guidelines. And to be even more challenging, if these ethical guidelines are not translated to how they're going to be implemented, then things can become very chaotic, because what's transparent for me may not be what's transparent for you. What's fair for me may not be the same idea of fairness for you, and especially for other minorities. So of course, we have to find uh, some some mechanisms that make this ethical approach more achievable, implementable, enforced. And that's when the discussion, the Congress, the Brazilian Congress, starts to develop. So when the discussion reached the Brazilian Senate, they created a commission of legal experts, which did a very throughput benchmark in the OECD countries to look how things were developing in these different regions. And then they started to draft a new bill, which is the bill that's being currently discussed. So this commission of legal experts drafted the first version. Then another commission was created with senators, And these commissions, all of those, held several public hearings with representatives from all sectors, from different economic sectors, from copyright authors, from civil society, academics. And little by little, we are developing this legislation that is trying to guarantee, of course, rules that can further innovation. So it has rules uh, for initiatives such as Sandbox. It has rules for uh, giving some flexibility for startups because, of course, they can't have a high regulatory barrier, so they have to have some flexibility. Uh, it has it has also initiatives to promote that the executive branch uh, has to further develop the educational system to include more computation, data science in the curriculum of students. But at the same time, it's also legislation that's looking for some governance mechanisms for some rights that needs to be guaranteed. And for governing all that, we have been trying to find this balance of not having just one central authority, because definitely that would be very challenging for this authority to work with such a transversal technology. So we want to have a sectoral approach, which in some way remember what remind us what we're seeing in the US. But looking also at the European experience, we're looking for some kind of coordination. So like the European will have the AI board with all the authorities. What we're doing at the national level, we are proposing that all sectoral regulators, so like the telecom regulator, the transportation regulator, the energy regulator, all of those may use AI, and all of those will enforce these rules in their sectors, but we'll have a coordination system with a central coordinating authority just to guarantee that this collaboration and some harmonization happens. So this is the proposal as of now. Of course, there's still some way to go, and in Brazil, sometimes things can go 108 degrees back. We know there's a lot of resistance from some sectors, especially some tech companies. So we cannot say that everything is assured for now, but this is the way that we are paving and we are developing our debate.
Yeah, that's very exciting time to put the directions to where we should go in terms of the AI period, which is evolving in these new technical innovation all over the world. But the problem is how we can take a balance then between innovations, protection. So where is the key part of the actions that all the regulators or other stakeholders in involvement in the processes. And as for the next question might be fits of these topics because you mentioned about the sandbox in sometimes. So that's a part of the good initiative, such as in Singapore is working a very proactively putting the regulators and sandbox system is a privacy tech space. So my question is, what is the future role of the regulatory sandbox in Brazil? So if you have anything just like any practical use case or some kind of thing that could be helpful, so could you share about your ideas?
Yeah, of course. Now, I see a lot of progress coming in terms of sandboxes. Of course, as any new approach, there's always some hype to that. Sometimes we see some institutions claiming they're developing sandbox, and actually they're developing other tools, other regulatory experimentation tools, which are also important and useful, but not necessarily sandboxes. Sometimes we see people developing innovation hubs, test beds, but in the end of the day, there's a lot of initiatives that are connected with the idea of sandbox. And just to share the view that I have on what sandbox would be, because of course it's still a concept in it. It's all development. It's still maturing what exactly a sandbox would be. I think we have to also consider that, but also for the audience that may not know so much about regulatory sandboxes. So basically, sandbox is a concept that we have in the IT sector for many years, and it's just this kind of uh, uh, si- uh, secure environment where you can develop your system, I mean your computer system, and then you can make some tests, and you can make uh, some visibility of the progress and the development of that system until it's mature enough for it to be deployed. That's the idea of a sandbox, right? And it reminds us a lot of like children playing a place that they can drop and they fall and they will not hurt that much because it's a comfortable space. So this concept has started migrating to also a regulatory landscape. And what we mean by that is that nowadays every sector has so many regulations that it sometimes becomes very complex for companies, especially startups, to start developing something in that sector uh, because they might feel constrained by these rules. And maybe that's one of the main reasons that the financial sector was the one that most started this, right? And this happened pretty much everywhere in the world, and Brazil is also one of the case. So one of the leading regulatory sandbox case in Brazil were done in our financial sector. We actually have not only one, but three different regulators, financial regulators in Brazil that are working with sandboxes. So we have a central bank, we have also the private security, and we have also the exchange equities regulators. So all of those have developed their own sandbox, and at some level they interact with each other. At the same time, and this is important because of course, when sandbox starts to become a thing, several other regulators have started to develop, at least here in Brazil, we've seen already initiatives have been developed in the transportation sector. So the transportation regulator, we have some designs also being made by the telecom authority and also the health authority. So they all are also starting the pilots. But we have to remember that each sector has its own characteristics, its own features. And that happens a lot in the private sector because private sector, like the private field, is not regulated the same way that many of the other regulators does. Like in many other cases, we first need a license to start developing something. Like for you to operate a telco company, you need some kind of authorization from the telco authority, right? For you to start the infrastructure project in transportation, you need first this kind of authorization. So many times when we're talking about sandbox in these sectors, we are looking for this space for testing something when you get like this kind of pre-authorization, this temporary authorization to test that initiative. For example, the transportation sector has been trying the free flow, right? With the way that you can go in oh, I just forgot the name in English. When you have to pass to pay the oh my God, I just forgot how to say that in English. I don't know if you know what I mean, but when you're traveling the road and then you have to pass to some spots and then you have to pay for the infrastructure of that pavement, right? So the thing is, the free flow allows you to just have this small machine in your car and you just pass directly and it will just be discounted from your bank account, right? So this has been tested, and it has been very successful here in Brazil. It's toll. Sorry, I remember the word. It's toll. So you don't need to stop to pay the toll anymore. You just can go. But this, of course, is still being tested because it's still in a sandbox. But it has been so successful that it's probably will become the rule instead of the exception. But now, after giving some examples like that, let's go back to the private sector. Privacy regulations, data protection regulations, they don't have a pre-authorization. Like, imagine if every company that wants to process personal data needed first an authorization from the DPA to start processing. First, the DPA would be overloaded with like millions of requests. And at the same time, we would not be able to develop any system to innovate because they would all have to wait for this overloaded DPA for them to start processing. That's why the risk-based approach of data protection is all the other way around. You, as a data processor, as a data controller, so when you will decide that you're going to process personal data for some interest, be it profitable or not, you just do it. But at the same time, you look for some governance rules, some governance mechanisms. So you guarantee that you can be accountable for what you're doing, right? So since there's this shift, a sandbox in the private sector cannot be about waivers. It's way more about this collaboration of uh, getting the participants, the innovators, closer to the authorities so can understand better what are these governance mechanisms, what are best practice, what could be done. And at the same time, for the regulator, it allows the regulator to have use cases, very close use cases, to understand how these innovators are trying to uh, develop systems that are more uh, compatible and in conformity with the data protection regulation. And so, in this sense, you find this point of balance of responsible innovation in whichever kind of technology we might be talking about. And this is also what we see in the AI sector, right? The AI regulation is way closer to data protection in that sense because we don't expect that people will need pre-authorizations to develop AI systems. This, once again, would break the whole economy chain, right? So what we are doing is, okay, you develop your AI system, but you try to look at the risk level. How risky is your system? Depending on how risky it is, you present more governance mechanisms than a no high risk system. So I believe sandbox and also in the AI field will look like this, a place for sharing best practice to make the regulator understand better what's being developed. And at the same time, since we need to find also a balance to not create an anti-competitive initiative, we have to guarantee that everything that's not a trade secret will be shared with others. Why am I saying that? Because, I mean, there's not only 10 companies developing AI right now, and the regulator, a very mature regulator, cannot deal with more than 10, 12 initiatives at the same time. Like the central bank is dealing with 10 use cases. The ICO in the UK is dealing with 10 or 12. So you cannot do that many. And of course, there are thousands of companies. So how you find this balance when you select in this case? These cases need to be as paradigmatical as possible because when you finish the testing, you're going to translate all the best practices of that initiative and share with others. So you guarantee that other companies that are developing similar systems will also have the chance of understanding better what the regulator is looking for. So in the end of the day, I could resume sandboxes, at least from a privacy perspective, as collaboration. right? As sharing best practice and sharing knowledge about the systems and the regulatory landscape. And I think this is how I see that things might develop. I'm hopeful that this might start because with the future AI regulation, we'll see a lot of these new regulatory sandbox approaches popping out. And I think within a few years, almost every authority in Brazil will have some kind of regulatory sandbox.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your thoughts. The sandbox system has been discussed among the many of the countries at this moment, and it's a key driver to examine of the practical use case and privacy technology. So we hope it comes to the more practical response from the regulators and the other involvement and the stakeholders. So that's been very important in Brazil as well. Thank you for sharing the insights. So finally, I'd like to ask you about the message for listeners because the you mentioned the cooperation is much important right this moment. So could you share about a few message to that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think what I could say to listeners is that we need to keep doing these actions just like what we're doing right now. So especially if you are in the tech field and you want to develop new ideas and especially those with that look for a responsible way of developing these new ideas, we have to keep exchanging because sometimes someone has already find a piece of the puzzle and we just need to connect with that person, you know? And I think in some sense, several of the experience that I've shared today show a lot about that, how the experience of a region can influence the other, how sometimes a specific approach may not work that well for a specific case, but in another case it may work. And we can only do that when we keep sharing our ideas, seeing what works, what doesn't work. I think also, and this is another message, we shouldn't be afraid of failing. What I mean by that is that like our society uh, has sometimes a very punitive approach to failure in the sense that oh, if you fail an exam, you are out. If you fail a rule, you might be sanctioned. So we are always afraid of failing. But what we need sometimes is to remember that failing is a way of learning. And that's another lesson that I get from sandboxes because sandbox has a lot of to do with field experimentation. So the failure is also important evidence to know, okay, this approach will not work. So let's try another one. And maybe tweaking a little bit the failed approach, we might find one that works. So we should also be a bit more open to failing as long as this becomes a lesson learned, you know? And I think also this is something that we might learn more with initiatives such as regulatory sandboxes.
Yeah, that's a great message. Regardless of your domains that you work, the challenges is the much of the my respect for action. So that's a very great message that inspires the audience from your experience. So again, Diego, thank you for joining the conversation today. It's a very important discussion with you, and happy to spread this kind of exchanging information, exchanging idea with a global colleague together. So thank you for joining again, Tiago, this moment.
And I want to thank you for inviting me, and for sure, it was very nice conversation. I hope to share also with my peers. I think these kind of initiatives are always welcome to me. And if at any point you also want to connect with other colleagues from Brazil, I would be more than happy to facilitate that.
Thank you.